Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our virtual center spotlight. I'm Nicole Frieso, Development Associate at Jeannie Geiger Crisis Center. We would like to use these virtual gatherings as an opportunity to share information on our different programs as well as the latest news from the center. Please note this event is being recorded. Before we dive in, I just wanted to take a moment to allow the other members of our staff to introduce themselves.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Suzanne Debus, CEO at the Jeannie Geiger Crisis Center. Nice to see you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kelly Dunn, Chief of Operations at Jeannie Geiger Crisis Center.
Good morning. I'm Kelly Majewski, Director of Advancement at the Center.
Good morning. I'm Alicia Peak, Communications Manager at the Crisis Center.
Today, you'll hear from Suzanne, who will give an overview of the center. Kelly Dunn will talk about our DV homicide prevention work, and Kelly Majewski will offer a financial update. During this portion of the program, all attendees will be muted to help prevent any background noise. However, there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end. At that time, you may unmute yourself and ask our speakers any questions that you may have, or if you'd like to direct the questions to me via the chat, you can do that as well. Before we begin, I just wanted to share a couple of tech-related suggestions. At the top right-hand corner of the screen, you'll have the option to view the event in gallery view or speaker view. If you're not currently viewing the event in speaker view, we recommend that you take a moment to switch it to that setting. And then, of course, at any time, if you have any Zoom-related technical questions, please direct them to me via the chat. Thank you, everyone. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Suzanne.
Good morning. Sorry, I have a very elderly dog who is in the middle of a barking thing. So I've just texted my husband asking him to please take care of the dog. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning. It means everything when people take time out of their very busy days to join yet another Zoom call, but to hear more about the center and in support of our mission to empower individuals and engage communities to end domestic violence. Typically, if we were in the office, you would be getting a tour, and why that's important is it's very hard for us to do these kinds of introductory sessions to the center and bring you through the offices when folks are there because of confidentiality. And so, you know, we try to create that story when you're in the office. And so you would be seeing where folks would be coming in to meet with their lawyer, their advocate, their therapist, to receive art therapy, or for their children to receive services. So this is what we're doing. This is the best we can. I wanted to start a little bit just with a quick overview. We know that domestic violence affects millions of people in the United States each year. And data shows us that 1 in 4 adult women and 1 in 7 men will experience severe physical violence from an intimate partner during their lifetime. We also know that as many as 10 million children every year in the United States are exposed to domestic violence. And we know that has long-term consequences. And so part of our work is really to help interrupt those the behavior and help folks heal. So I'm really proud of the work that we do. Over time, I think, have created an organization that is really responsive to the variety of issues faced by adult and child survivors alike. We've also been focusing on prevention. How do we help support young people to avoid unhealthy relationships in the future? And 3 years ago, we absorbed the Intimate Partner Abuse Education Program, which is for people who aren't in Massachusetts. It's a batterers intervention program, which is court mandated for men who use violence in their intimate relationships. And last year, we provided that work for over 200 men. Our survivor services, they range everything from, you know, the immediate crisis hotline calls, helping women get restraining orders. I say women, we also help male victims. And and we have support groups and therapy and legal representation. We also help with transitional housing and rental assistance and access to food. And we really try to anticipate both the short-term and the long-term needs that survivors have to help them get over that so that they can return to a life that is free of abuse and independent and safe. Our youth empowerment services, that's the program where we do primary prevention work in the schools. And we do everything from healthy relationships work to teen dating violence prevention. We have a Girls Inc. program, and we inspire all girls to be strong, smart, and bold. And that is really helping young girls connect to who they are and what excites them about the world, and keep them feeling good about themselves and not caving to peer pressure or anything that doesn't fit for them. And as I said before, we also have the intimate partner abuse education program. And one of the things that I'm excited about that kind of work is not only are we helping men, challenging men who have used violence in their relationships to think about who they are as men. Is this who they wanted to be when they grew up? Question their beliefs about the gender roles, their entitlement to have what they want without showing up with the sense of mutuality and partnership. And so we do that work with men for 40 weeks. We also have a Strong Fathers program, and this is a program for men who really want to be better fathers and don't want to bring patterns of abuse, even patterns of childhood abuse, into present day relationships with their children. So the fourth piece that we do is our domestic violence homicide prevention work, and that is the focus of our discussion this morning. And Kelly Dunn, our Chief Operating Officer, is here this morning to talk to us about that work.
Good morning, everyone. So nice to see your faces. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our domestic violence high-risk team model. And I'm going to pull up a few slides just to help kind of walk you through this. So this is a schematic of kind of the model. I'll talk you through it in a minute, but this model has been replicated now in 26 communities in the Commonwealth and in hundreds of communities across the US. But it started here, really in our attempt to try to save the life of a woman who was trying to escape her abusive husband. And we were unsuccessful in that case. The woman we were working with ultimately was killed here locally, but it taught us some important lessons about what was missing in our systems as far as really working with victims who are at the highest end of danger in domestic violence cases. We certainly work across the spectrum. We get hotline calls from every day from people in new relationships saying, I'm seeing this behavior, it's concerning me, is it abusive? And we certainly are there for those women. And then we have women on the other end of the spectrum, and really they are trying to escape with their lives these abusive relationships. And this was certainly the case of Dorothy, a woman that we were working with. And I have to take you back to March 20th, 2002, and tell you that story for me to really explain how this model has now become a national model for homicide reduction. But truly, it was in our effort and in the aftermath of this homicide that we created this model and saw this gap in the system. So Dorothy was murdered March 26, 2002. I was a very young advocate at the time, and we were working on her case. And we knew her case was dangerous. We had assigned a lawyer to her case. She was in a shelter, but had come out of a shelter because her husband had filed for emergency custody of her children. Those of us working in the field of domestic violence know that the kind of number one motivator for women often in trying to leave abusive relationships is losing custody of their children. It is often their biggest concern about leaving and what keeps them in the relationship. So Dorothy had fled to a shelter to try to protect her children, and ultimately came out of shelter and came back to Massachusetts because her husband had filed an emergency order of custody. He had been before the court only 4 days before he killed her, and he was released and back in the community on $500 cash bail. So the morning of her murder, I've worked at the center for 20 years. At that time, I think I was working at the center for about 4 years. I came in, I opened the door, and someone said, someone was killed last night. And without skipping a beat, I said it was Dorothy. It was the first words that came out of my mouth. And we worked with over 1,000 women that year. But how did I immediately, without pause, say it was Dorothy? And I knew it was because her case had all of the red flags for homicide. So we have established through the research that some domestic violence cases are more likely to escalate to homicide than others. So there is this research base to tell us that if there are these red flags in a case, that case is more likely to escalate to homicide or a near lethal assault than another case. And so her case and these red flags for homicide were almost a perfect match. So you have here the 19 red flags for homicide, and her case had 15 of those 19. And so we knew her case was really dangerous, but yet we didn't have the mechanism to prevent the terrible ending of this case, which was for her husband to break through the door in violation of an order of protection, run past the 11-year-old daughter and kill her, shoot at our police officers, and then kill himself ultimately when the police responded to the home. And so this was the sticky note that was on her file. It says very lethal case, right? So a sticky note on a file where the domestic violence organization is aware that the case is very high risk, but the rest of the system doesn't have that information is not a good system for response. And so we never again wanted to be the only people who know how dangerous a case was, when we really needed the courts and the police and everyone else who were involved in this case to have that piece of information, to view her case as potentially lethal as we did. And so that was sort of the first problem that we recognized, is that we all operate in silos, that although we had really good police trying to work this case and an excellent detective and an excellent judge on this case, we had this gap in information. Each one of us had a little piece of information about this case, but we didn't all have all of the information that was really evident to us after the homicide. And so these are some of the local headlines, and this case actually got local and national attention because he was released 4 days before he killed her. And sort of the simple analysis is the judge shouldn't have released him. But that really, those of us working the case knew it was more complicated than that. We knew there was this lack of information before the court, that the judge really didn't have any information to hold this offender, that there was no documented history of domestic violence, although there was a long, long history of domestic violence, right? But it wasn't documented. She was always afraid to call the police. And so these were the gaps that we identified in our system. We had no way to take all of the many domestic violence cases we were working with and pull forward those that were most dangerous. So we needed some mechanism to take all of the cases and really to pull forward the most dangerous cases so we could deal with those cases differently. Even if we could identify those cases that were most dangerous, we had a siloed system. The police and prosecutors and probation officers, we all worked in our silos. We had no way of sharing information across systems and really having a central information repository for the most dangerous cases. And what that left us with is making decisions without the best information in front of us. And what we want to do with this model is give those of us who are in decision making, who are making decisions about these cases, we want them to have the best information in front of them at the time they have to make that decision. Because these cases move quickly, things change, and you really only get one chance to make a decision sometimes in these very dangerous cases. We also realized that we had this assumption, and we didn't realize it at the time, but after, it was very clear to us that we thought the most dangerous women who were at the most danger for homicide, would go into shelter. We sort of didn't realize that we had this assumption that, this is why we built this shelter system, right? So those who are really in fear can go hide in shelters. And what Dorothy's case brought to us so evidently is that women can't stay in shelters forever, and that lots of women don't want to go into shelter for very good reasons. If you can think about living centrally with other people who are traumatized, with your children living in a central location, leaving your home, leaving your job, it's time when you really need support the most. That's a really difficult decision for folks, and it doesn't seem like it's fair to rely on that as a solution for those most at risk. And so that's the problem we went about solving. And this model helps to solve that problem. And so what we did was we used that research that was really sitting in, research journals and, scholarly articles, but we really hadn't applied it in the field, this risk assessment research, this risk assessment research that could tell us with a lot of certainty which cases are the most dangerous. We then, once we identify those cases, we send those cases on to a multidisciplinary team. So that siloed system I told you about, we started working together. So now police, prosecutors, Jeannie Geiger Crisis Center, many organizations, we come together once a month around a table and discuss the most dangerous cases in the community and really try to provide safety together. Then we're trying to get victims into services, those most at danger for being killed into services. There's some research that suggests that services may be protective against homicide. And then we monitor those cases as they go through our system so we can make adjustments because things change quickly. So that's the model. It's simple in design. It's a little more complicated in application, but its design is simple. And so it's really based on this belief that domestic violence homicide is predictable and preventable. And Dorothy's case showed us that. We knew that case had the potential to escalate to lethal levels. And we were sort of left in the aftermath knowing if we change nothing, if this exact fact pattern comes around again, we will get the exact same result. So we had to go about changing the system. And luckily, locally, we had a judge who brought the community together, and we had a community who was really willing to look at this research and work with us in thinking about a different way to do this. It's not something we could move forward on our own. It really was a community effort to think about this differently. So before Dorothy's homicide, we were experiencing, we had 8 domestic violence related homicides in the local community in the span of about 10 years. And since then, and I'm wicked suspicious, so I always have to knock on wood, we've had no domestic violence homicides in the communities reporting into our high-risk team model. So we pulled out this clip yesterday. We actually haven't watched this in a while, but given the times, it seems appropriate. So although our response was local, what we didn't realize at the time when we created this model is we had tapped into something that other communities needed. They needed something for their victims at highest risk of being killed that wasn't shelter. They were looking for that alternative. They were finding cases, where victims were being killed and they only had shelter to offer them. So we did not realize we had tapped into something. Ultimately, the model became to the attention of the Department of Justice, Office on Violence Against Women, and they talk about it as a promising practice to prevent intimate partner homicide. And we were lucky enough to have our then Vice President, now President, Joe Biden, talk about the model. So although he doesn't get the names quite right, the sentiment is there. So let's watch him talk a little bit about it.
One of the most important things we learned is we have to do more to help victims stay safe. Once they've outed themselves, once they've come out and said, I need help, Joe, keeping them safe is hard, really hard. We need to provide legal protections for victims at the time they need it most. The most dramatic violence, the most dramatic violent murders occur shortly after the victim tries to leave. That's the most dangerous moment. That's the moment, you all know this, I'm preaching to the choir here. And we need to pick up on the warning signs, much better than we have thus far. There have been moments when the system could have worked better, when lives could have been saved. We know this because of what happened to a woman like Dorothy Cotter, who was 35 years old, a compassionate, beautiful woman, mother of 2 young daughters. She had suffered years of severe abuse at her husband's hands. Years. Dorothy's case had all the warning signs of homicide. Jenny Krieger of Newburyport, Massachusetts, where Dorothy sought help, wrote a note in her file when she went in. They said, quote, very lethal case was the quote on the file. But they didn't have the tools to coordinate with the police and the courts. After Dorothy's husband shot her, the Crisis Center made a commitment, not only to screen every single woman for the warning signs, but also to bring everyone together to interrupt that cycle of escalating violence. And that's how it goes. It escalates. It's kind of like drug addiction. It escalates. It never stays the same. There have been no domestic homicides in that community since that project began. We need to replace what we've been doing and replicate this kind of success. The Justice Department gets this. Today, they've released a new tool to help everyone.
So part of that new tool was funding to spread the model nationally. So we now are a technical assistance provider. So in addition to our local team, which is active and robust, we also have a national training and technical assistance grant through the Department of Justice that helps us work with other communities who want to replicate the model. So we have 21 states, certainly not the whole state, but we have teams in 21 states that we've worked with that have replicated the model or have replicated it on their own. We also realized that we needed a more established research-based risk assessment tool. So we worked with the leading researchers in intimate partner homicide from Johns Hopkins University, an amazing researcher called Dr. Campbell, who established those original 19 red flags for homicide. And we translated that to a quicker tool that police could use. So we now have a risk assessment tool called the Danger Assessment for Law Enforcement, and we translated that research into a sort of quicker tool that's more tailored towards police officers. And we have 26 police departments utilizing that, what we call the DALE, the Danger Assessment for Law Enforcement. And so that danger assessment for law enforcement tool really also filled a gap in the service delivery. There were some tools out there, but they were too long for law enforcement to administer on scene, or they use the criminal justice history, so the criminal history, to assess their risk. And we really wanted to use victim information to assess their risk. We saw early that using the criminal justice to assess risk could really perpetuate the bias that's already built into the criminal justice system. So not using that as the source of information to assess risk and really using the victim as the source of information to assess risk was what we wanted to utilize. We also knew that we wanted our tool to become a supplement to the police report, and we wanted it to attach to the police report and to be available to the court. There were a couple of law enforcement tools out there, but they really weren't built to be used in the court setting. So we learned from Dorothy's case that we didn't want to know the case was high risk, but then not have an ability to attach that information for everyone else who was touching the case. And so that's why we developed a specific tool to fill a need, although there were risk assessment tools out there, not one that filled this need. So we now own that tool along with Johns Hopkins, and after we train communities, they have the ability to utilize that tool, but only after we train their officers. And so here's how it works now. So in communities using our model, when they respond to a domestic violence call for help, when the police respond, they do that 11-question DALE, or that 11-question risk screening tool. That will bring forward the most dangerous cases, those cases that have the highest potential to escalate to lethal levels. That smaller portion of cases goes on, and we immediately connect those victims with services. So the idea is as soon as we identify that case as high risk, we're trying to get that victim connected to services. We know from the research, helping a woman understand her risk or a victim understand their risk, they're more likely to engage with services. That information then goes on to the court to inform bail and bond proceedings. And then that case moves on to the high risk team, and they do the long-term risk management. These cases can take a long time to go through the system. We can have witness intimidation as the case goes through the system. We can have new violations of probation. And so the high risk team becomes the risk management portion of this case. And all of those partners work together to increase the safety for the victim. And so luckily we've built into this kind of a data collection mechanism. And so all of the communities using both our domestic violence high risk team and our DALE send research, but they send data back to us on a regular basis, because we believed early that that you have to be able to measure it to know if it's working. It was almost a blessing that for many, many years, this program had no funding, because what it allowed us to do is really just create the model based on the need and what the data was telling us was we didn't have to respond to a funder's request. And so we've built that data now in as we've implemented the model in many states. And so data comes back to us on a regular basis, which really helps us to learn things and to fine tune the model. And so we've had 17,444 exactly DALEs administered since the last data we received from our communities utilizing the tool. What we've learned is only about 11% of the time does the victim decline the tool. So overwhelmingly, victims are willing to participate in this tool, not just in Massachusetts, but in Cleveland, in California, in New York, in all of the places where we've used this tool. We only have about 11% of victims declining the screen when officers ask them if they'd like to participate in the risk screening tool. We also have 80% of those victims identified as high risk connecting to services. So 80% of victims who are identified as high risk through these 17,000 screens have been connected to services all across the United States. So after this initial launch of high-risk teams in many jurisdictions, we received a grant from the Department of Justice to do a National Domestic Violence Homicide Prevention Demonstration Initiative, which is a very long name. But essentially, they wanted to test the model in Cleveland and do some research on it. And so we did a large implementation in half of the city of Cleveland. And what we found in our implementation is that we did see a reduction in homicide in Cleveland. So prior to the implementation of the high-risk team and the DALE, that half of the city was experiencing about 2.5 domestic violence homicides per year. Since the implementation, we saw almost an immediate drop to an average of about 1 per year. So that's a 62% reduction in those 2 police precincts in half of the city of Cleveland. We need to get some new data from Cleveland. This data is almost a year old, but what we're hearing anecdotally is that this trend is continuing. Even through the pandemic, when they're seeing a real increase in homicides generally, they're not seeing that increase in their intimate partner homicides with this model in place. So as we've moved the model outside of Massachusetts and into other states, particularly into Cleveland, we've learned a lot. And one of the lessons that we've really learned and we're really focusing on in the years ahead is making sure that this model is having the same impact on all communities, and learning how we need to customize the model to be more responsive to communities. So I think why we've been successful in moving outside of Massachusetts and into Ohio and New York and California is because we've known early that it has to change. The model doesn't look the same in Cleveland as it looks in our local community, right? It has to be responsive to the community needs. And so we always say about 80% of the model stays the same and about 20% of the model is really customized to meet the local conditions, the local laws, the local policies, and also the community makeup. We know that there's a disparate impact on particularly Black women in intimate partner homicide. They're murdered at 2.5 times the rate of white women. And so we've really been looking at how do we expand the pathways to safety to make sure that, number one, those that are most impacted by domestic violence homicide are those that are sitting on high-risk teams. So making sure we had representation on the teams of the communities most impacted by homicide. And also, how do we expand pathways for victims, knowing that some victims will never contact the law enforcement system, right? Knowing that some victims don't even want to go to a mainstream domestic violence program, but they're more comfortable going to their faith community or their community health center or the resettlement center, right? Immigrant victims particularly. And so we're reaching out to those communities to talk more about how can we create additional pathways to safety in those systems for victims who are not going to necessarily come in contact with the mainstream domestic violence program or law enforcement. And so these are really emerging but important conversations as we continue to implement the model in diverse communities. So that's a lot. I think I've used all of my time, but thank you all, and we're happy. I'm happy to answer any questions. But actually, I think I better turn it back over. I think that's my job now, to turn it back over.
Thank you so much, Kelly. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to our Director of Advancement, Kelly Majewski. Oh.
Kelly Majewski, you're on mute, but you know what I might say to everybody else who's on this call while Kelly's unmuting is, so you have a chance to ask questions, and so if you haven't already texted them to Nicole or chatted them to Nicole, feel free to be formulating your questions. Kelly Majewski.
Yes, I am unmuted. I hear that you are muted at least 10 times a day, so I apologize. My dog was acting up in the background. So I am Kelly Majewski, and I'm the Director of Advancement here at the center. I'm just sharing with you a little bit about our budget. And so the center has a $3.4 million budget, and my role as Director of Advancement and my team is responsible for raising a little over $1 million of that 3.4 million. And how we do this is through grants, fundraising events, and donations from individuals. We're also working to get the word out about the center and our work. And to do this, we're developing an ambassador program that will help to spread the word about our services, share our story, and educate different communities about how we can help. And so basically, this can be done through social media, work affiliations, or through personal networks. And if this is something that you're interested in learning more about, please feel free to reach out and let me know. So again, I'd like to thank you all for your time and attention. And at this time, we're going to turn it over to the Q&A portion.
Great, thank you, Kelly. So we actually have a couple of questions that came through via the chat. Open them up here. Okay, so the first is, why would victims not want to participate in a risk screening tool?
Well, for many reasons. I think for some victims, there is a historical and valid mistrust with the criminal justice system and law enforcement generally, and they're not really interested in participating in those systems for very good reasons. It may be the approach of the officer. It may be the fear that this information will come back to them, that the offender will know that they've answered these questions and provided information, and there will be what we call retribution violence. Most victims are killed in the process of leaving the relationship, so they know once they've called law enforcement in, their risk is probably escalated, and so they're afraid to answer those questions for very good reasons. Offenders often escalate violence when victims are trying to leave. So those are the main reasons that victims would decline the screen.
Thank you, Kelly. How many high-risk cases are there locally on the high-risk team?
That's a good question. So I ran the local high-risk team for many, many years, but have subsequently turned it over to some staff who are doing a beautiful job running it. I think we're at about 150. Lindsay's here with me, and she does the data for the local team. Is that about right, Linz?
I don't know currently, but our last safety and accountability report, there was 172.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Do victims sit on the high-risk team, and how do you handle confidentiality if so?
So victims don't sit on the high-risk team. It would logistically just not work. Victims, a lot of the information is confidential. We would have to have one victim come in and then leave, another victim come in. It just logistically we couldn't operate that way. Confidentiality works this way, that victims under the laws of Massachusetts, everything they tell an advocate at the crisis center or any of the domestic violence across the state is confidential unless they sign a written release. And so all victims that we send on to the high-risk team is absolutely with their permission. So we could have a victim at very high risk of homicide who does not want to sign that release. That information does not go to the high-risk team. But on the flip side of that, police do not have that expectation of confidential privilege. And so they may bring a case forward, a very dangerous case. They may have responded to a home where there was a stabbing or a strangulation attempt. And we may be working with that victim, and she says, you know what, I don't want you to talk to law enforcement. I don't want you to share any of my information. We absolutely will not do that. But that doesn't mean law enforcement doesn't come to the table and say, we responded to 20 Main Street last night, and here's what we found. And so we can take in information from the other partners and use that to help that victim. But we do not share information ever without the victim's permission. It is all permission-based.
Great, thank you. Do you get pushback from police officers who don't want to change their processes? And if so, how do you manage that?
We've become pretty skilled at managing that. We trained half of the city of Cleveland police officers, and we said if we could make it through that training, we were good. We learned a lot. We toughened up a little bit after that experience. They were great, but they are a very under-resourced department with a lot of stressors, particularly at the time we came into the Cleveland Police Department. So we've gotten much better about training police. Do we get pushback? Yeah. I mean, we go into police departments and we're introducing a new piece of paperwork where, no one's excited about that. We have to get the investment of the responding officer. And so we've learned how to do that. And we do that in many ways. As we come in only after we've talked to prosecution and judges. So we cannot go up to officers and say, we're asking you to do one more thing when you respond to these cases, without saying, before we ever came to you, we got the judges on board, we've got the prosecutors on board. They are prepared to respond to this. If you do this well, we can make an impact. We show them the impact from other states so that they can see that. We come back to our responding officers on a regular basis. And so we don't come in and train once and then never see them again. Officers all across the country who have gone into all different departments have told us, people come in and launch these programs, they ask us to do things, and then they never come back and tell us, is it working? Are we having an impact? Is anything we're doing matters? And so we've built that feedback loop in where we go back to patrol regularly and say, hey, here's how you're doing with this. Here's the impact you're having. Here are the outcomes of some of those cases. We bring quotes from victims and we try to keep the line officers responded. So do we get pushback initially? Yes, but they really do accept the tool. In Cleveland, which is the most under-resourced department I have ever been in, and one of the busiest with a backlog of cases where they've got 5, 6, 7 cases deep stacked up waiting for response. They've done the tool well and consistently. And so we've really learned that if a city like Cleveland can do it, we have all our departments telling us we're too busy, and we're like, nope, we don't buy it. If Cleveland can do this consistently, almost any community can do it.
Great. We have lots of questions coming in. This is great. Thank you, everyone. Let's see here. The next one. Are there programs in place for young boys to help them think of other ways to cope with anger, frustration, fear, and/or low confidence, emotions that may contribute to violence later?
Yes. And Michelle's here, and some of our other people from our prevention team, they're probably more qualified to answer that question, specifically on working with younger boys in response.
I would say there's definitely a void. That's something that people have asked about for a really long time. And it's something that people recognize, and it's not really something that's well funded. And in the intimate partner abuse education program, working with adults, they're typically court ordered. So we have a hook. We have a reason for them to participate. When you get to teenage boys, if you don't have some motivator, it's hard to get them to participate in services. There are times periodically over the years that schools will get involved, and then there's times where the schools are hyper-focused on academics and all sorts of social services fall to the wayside. So it's sort of a pendulum shift, but there is definitely people that are interested. We do provide some services for teen boys, but to have a specialized healthy relationship services, that's definitely something that's not really where it needs to be. And that's across the state of Massachusetts. That's not just a JGCC thing. That's definitely something that it really needs better funding, a higher level of understanding. And I think as far as children who witness domestic violence, those services are something that people really get behind. And then there is that void for the teenagers.
And I want to add something about our school prevention programs. Unfortunately, since coronavirus started, we've only been able to successfully do one of our prevention programs remotely, and that's been our Girls Inc. program, because it's kind of a ready community, and they're eager to stay connected with each other and to our staff. For typically when we're in schools, we run a program for teenage boys based on the documentary The Mask You Live In, which really encourages boys to think beyond those stereotypical images of what it means to be a man, and offers, it really invites them to think about stepping outside that very narrow definition and express their full humanity, which means feelings and not being so tough all the time. And a really great thing about that program is that once the teenage boys go through this program, so first they watch the documentary, then there's an 8-week program, and then they're asked to go and run the same program at the middle school. And so because of coronavirus, we haven't gotten to part B, but, and we have also done the program successfully with 8th grade boys. So we still have a lot to do, but that's where we are right now.
I can also say, working with the adult offenders, many of them at the end of their 40 weeks will say, why didn't this exist as a, when I was a teenager? Where was everybody when I was younger? So even adult abusers absolutely support that there needs to be interventions for the younger teenage population.
Thank you, Michelle. Another question that came through. So why do some areas not take advantage of your programs, and what do you feel can be done to encourage their participation?
Well, truthfully, we have more requests than we can manage right now from communities. So we've never done any sort of advertisement of this program. The Department of Justice found us because they heard about us from communities who heard about us from communities. So it's all just been calls from communities saying, we had this horrible homicide last night. It had all of the red flags for lethality. We hear you guys are doing something with the research. Can you help us? And so right now, we have a list of probably 25 communities waiting for the model that we just don't have the capacity to do. All of the funding for this model either comes from communities paying us directly or from the Department of Justice federal funding. So we don't do local fundraising for this. It comes from the Department of Justice. So we could double our staff, triple our staff tomorrow to help the communities waiting for this model.
Thank you, Kelly. Given the results from the demonstration project in Cleveland, what are the next steps?
We're waiting the final report from the National Institute of Justice for Cleveland. So we've collected our own data, which I've showed you, but they are also collecting data and will be issuing a report. So we are anxiously awaiting that report. Cleveland has sort of a postscript to Cleveland. As I showed you data from half the city, we have spread the model to the other half of the city. So now they have a citywide implementation, and they're working towards a countywide implementation. And so the model has really worked well in Cleveland. There's also some technical things that it coordinates very well with the bail laws that they have in Cleveland. And there's been a lot of acceptance for the model, I think, because we started with the 2 toughest police precincts in the city. There was a feeling that if those police officers could manage this risk tool, that the other officers could do it, and they really did a good job with it. So there's been a lot of widespread acceptance with Cleveland, and the data really shows the impact. And so that's really helped Cleveland to spread the model successfully. Plus, there's just some great people on the ground in Cleveland doing the work.
Great. Next question, how can we get this law enforcement risk program into our local police station?
Contact us. We would be happy to talk to you about that. We never say no, we just say when. Like we will get to you eventually. And we are hoping this year to be able to fund some technology so that we can do implementation quicker and use technology to work with more communities. We see, an ability to really expand our community through technology, but please have them call us. They can send me an email at dvhrt. Lindsay, what's the email?
She just put it into the chat. Thank you, Lindsay.
You're welcome.
dvhrt@jeanniegeiger.org, and we will get back to them immediately.
Great. Thank you. Another question came through. What would the next big win be for the program?
I think the next big win would be two things. I think to use technology for more implementation, so really to get some online training in place. And I also think to use technology to really improve our data collection. So the data has really driven this. So it's been since day one. So I told you about that homicide at the beginning. And really, when we went to the community to say, hey, we've got an idea to maybe do this differently, from day one, we collected data because our promise to the local community was, in 2 years, if we're not having impact, we'll stop doing this. We all don't need more work to do. And we don't know if this is going to work, but we think it will. And so we collected data locally from year one. And so we, now as we spread the model, we have communities collect data, but number one, it's difficult and time consuming. And so they could really use like a fancy data system where they could collect data quicker and it could come directly to us. And I think we could make better use of the data. It really helps us to think about, how the model looks in urban communities and rural communities, and the data tells us so much about how it's working. And so I'd really love, and I know Lindsay, who works with me on the data and tries to collect all of this data from communities, we're really doing it on Excel spreadsheets. We really need like technology to do the data collection better. Suzanne, would you add to that wish list?
Yes, excuse me, the other thing that I would add to the wish list is simply more experts on staff who can work directly with communities, so that the list of communities that are looking for help doesn't continue to grow with the same limited number of people and hours to deliver. So that would be my wish list: data, technology, and people.
Good one.
Sounds good to me.
Thank you. Looks like we have one other here. Regarding the risk assessment, is it also intended to be used in situations where the actual person being abused is arrested, but it's obvious that they are not the perpetrator?
So the risk assessment, so we have a training for the danger assessment, and law enforcement can't use the tool without the training. The training is critical. They cannot use the tool, they can't use the Dale screen if they do what you call a dual arrest, if they arrest both parties. So they have to properly determine the predominant aggressor in order to use the tool. So the training is, if you're arresting both parties, neither party gets the screen, which is why it's so important that law enforcement is trained well to do what we call to properly identify the predominant aggressor on scene, which may not, if the victim, it's a complicated issue that I won't get into, but that's the answer. They have to determine who the victim is in order to do the risk screen. They cannot do it on both parties. If they can't determine predominant aggressor, the screen is not completed.
Thank you, Kelly. We had one more that just came through. Have you tried the teach the teacher approach? So, in having your model or creating your presence in a state with approaching your model without having to create your own presence in the state. So like a teach the teacher approach.
So after the Cleveland training, when we did 26 separate individual trainings of police officers in order to hit all 383 officers, we did those 26 trainings over 4 days. So 3 a day, beginning at 4 in the morning and ending at 9 at night, so we could hit every shift. A very tired staff found its way from Cleveland back to Massachusetts and said, we got to think of a better way to do this. And although we learned a lot working with those officers, and I would not go back and do it differently because it was incredibly important for us with the new curriculum to talk to officers and to really roll it out, we realized that that's just not sustainable. And so we do have a train the trainer option now, where we will train sort of officer trainers that will then go train their departments. I have to say, I have some reservations about it, that everything is translated in that process. It's very difficult to train an officer to, we can speak about the experience in other communities. I really feel like it's important that officers have a chance. I want them to verbalize their concerns. I want to hear their skepticism. I want to have a chance to discuss it with them because I really need their buy-in in order for the model to work well. So I feel like that's really tough to translate in the train the trainer model, but we have made it available in the with the knowledge that we just can't we can't train every officer, and so we do offer a train the trainer model.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. So it looks like those are all the questions that we have received via the chat. If anybody else has any questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself at this time and ask them directly. Otherwise, if you don't have any further questions, we just want to thank you again so much for attending. Thanks so much for the great interaction at the end here. Kelly Majewski will be in touch within the next week or so just to get your feedback and to see if you have any other questions or, to learn how you may be interested in becoming involved in the center. And again, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Very informative.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.